design collective Matrix, which, though active from 1980 to the mid-1990s, has continued to inspire and inform new feminist practice, action and critique in the built environment in the UK and internationally. So the reputation of Matrix is one now, we know, on an international scale. So today we're welcoming just three of the Matrix group, and Thorne and Fran Bradshaw, who together went on after Matrix disbanded to form the award-winning practice and Thorne Architects. They're particularly well known for their sustainable approach and participatory ways of working. Some notable projects include the Aldgate Subways renovation in London and the almost completed Cannock Mill co-housing for older people in Colchester, really worth looking at. And we welcome, in fact, for a second time in the public lecture series, Joss Boyce, who's now at the Bartlett and who last time gave a talk on disability and architecture. Her current project, Disorderly Architecture, which brings disabled artists together with design educators, is up for a William Sutton Prize, and delighted to say that 10 students had the experience of being part of that project here at Newcastle last year. We're very lucky that Joss has been able to step in today, as Julia Dwyer, who was meant to be here, isn't able to travel today. Julia was absolutely central in the technical aid centre aspects of Matrix's work, and she is a fabulous educator, most recently at the University of Westminster, an artist, an architect, and for me as well as many others, an incredible enabler and mentor. And we've got a few words from her to read shortly. It's been a very difficult decision to hold this public lecture in the middle of the UCU strike today, while many of us are taking industrial action in support of better pension and working conditions for contracted and casualised staff. But we felt that as this was a public lecture taking place outside regular hours, without any of us needing to cross a picket line, we would go ahead with this long-planned opportunity to bring Matrix members together back at the university where the seeds for Matrix were sown. And I think I might just say that if anyone wants to join us on the picket tomorrow, we'd love to see you there. Let's imagine for a moment that we are sitting in this lecture theatre in the mid-70s. Did you sit in this lecture theatre in the mid-70s? Okay. Perhaps the lecturer is telling us about community participation and consultation that's happening with Ralph Erskine at Byker, which is on site a few miles away. And you might notice, if you were looking around then, that there are rather more female students in the audience than was typical in an architecture school at the time. This was because of an enlightened policy to widen access to architectural education by reducing the grade criteria for admission. And that's how, as well as many other members of those cohorts during those years, the four founder members of Matrix, Anne Thorne, Fran Bradshaw, Barbara McFarlane, who's not here today, and also the late Sue Francis, came to do their architecture BAs at Newcastle, and that's where they first met.
And Anne de Graaf Johnson.
And Anne de Graaf Johnson. Thank you. Joss, by the way, did her degree at Bartlett, and Julia studied in Sydney before coming to London to study at the AA. So I thought it was worth remembering this admissions policy now, and how crucial steps like this are to improve diversity and change in architecture. In the UK, still less than 30% of registered architects are women, but underrepresentation in the profession is even more serious in terms of race, class and disability. It's great that we're now seeing so many campaigns for change, from Black Women in Architecture to Parlour in Australia and Part W Collective. But Matrix was, and is in its legacy, much more than a women-only practice. Its members brought feminist critique and principles to every aspect of the production of the built environment. And I've got a long section where I was going to list these, but I think it's much better for you guys to do that. As Julia Dwyer and Anne Thorne put it in 2007, it was not sufficient simply to have more women enter the profession as it stood. Feminist architecture entails what they called a radical critique of the profession, And this need remains as relevant today as it was in the 80s and 90s, perhaps even more so with the increasing withering of the state. So please join me in a warm welcome for Anne, Fran and Joss for their talk entitled Matrix and After Ways of Working Around Feminism and Architecture. So, thank you.
I'm Joss, and I'm going to start. And you can probably all read the quote from the book, on the cover of the book. Our intentions were to develop an understanding of how we are placed as women in a man-made environment and to use that knowledge to subvert it. And I think lots of things have changed and lots of things actually haven't changed, or they've changed, they've gone sideways, but there's still issues around the position of women within architecture as a discipline. And for us, certainly for me, in the late 70s into the 80s when we were doing this work, it's like everybody acted as if the built environment was completely neutral, that there was not such a thing, that space didn't have gendered effects. To even say that, well, I'm not even sure there's a language to say that, the word sexism didn't exist. There were things you couldn't say, so that made it quite hard to think them. And for me, especially meeting these two and many of the other women involved, that was a framework, a collective framework, where we could begin to work out what it is that we were looking at. Does this work? No. So, would you just see your
Okay. So we wanted, I think, I wanted to, but you also wanted to. It's a nice coincidence to remember that Matrix was not just Anne, Fran and Joss, or indeed Anne Julia, but many women work for Matrix, so who aren't here now. We're going to read. Would you like me to read them out?
I think, well,
Janet Wong, Susan Walker, Anne Thorne, Kath Taylor, Marion Roberts, Anne Louise Pirrie, Susie Nelson, Kathleen Morrison, Sheila McManus, Barbara McFarlane, Jill Mathewson, Pippa Mansell, Anne Kolodowski, Vicky Swinburne, Jane Rendell, Gozi Wamuo, Connie Mansueto, Mo Hildenbrandt, Claire Herniman, Janie Grote, Anne Graf Johnson, Benedict Fu, Rachel Ferguson, Sue Francis, Julia Dwyer, Anne Dunton, Zana Dean, Jane Dark, Hansa Tudor-Sama, Helen Brown, Fran Bradshaw, Joss Boyce, Kate Baker, Jeanette Arega and Elizabeth Adams.
And the reason for mentioning that is both how extraordinary that was, I think, for all of us in many different ways, as well as full of tensions and complications, but also how there's also a legacy here which isn't just a legacy of Matrix, it's the legacy of what all those women and the people that they work with and influence went on to do, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk a bit about Anne Thorne architect as well. They asked me to talk to this. This is just that reminder that Newcastle Uni is where this whole thing started, really, with they'll tell you the story some other time about their experience of being students here in that period. They're well worth listening to, those stories. So, one of the things that's happened recently is that Matrix is come back into fashion in some ways. I mean, I don't know that it ever went out of fashion. I think people have tried to find out information about what happened there, not just with Matrix, but with a whole range of alternative practices. Part W asked us to go up for the RIBA Gold Medal, and we had some really lovely letters from people supporting that, and this is one of them from Professor Linda Clark. Their work was incredibly radical, not only by being women-led and collaborative platform, but also by integrating new interdisciplinary ways of working across theory and practice. So that's what I want to talk about, just introduce some of those things that happened. Matrix grew out of this thing called the New Architecture Movement. Some of you may have heard of the New Architecture Movement, which was a kind of quite left-wing movement in the 70s, made up of architects in practice trying to unionise practice. And it was out of that a group of women got together because there were things that were going on that didn't seem to fit with there seemed to be issues where things related to gender just were being ignored. And out of that, a meeting was held to see, to invite women to come and talk about architecture and feminism, and 60 women turned up, so that was in '78. And that then became Feminist Design Collective.
Yeah.
So that became a named group, and the issues around, which began to discuss issues around feminism and architecture. This is a cartoon by Janice Goodman, who did a lot of the illustrative work for Matrix. And one of the things I think you'll see is the kind of range of media that we used at a time when it was all done on paper and rather freehand. And that group, what was interesting about that group of 60, obviously it changed, it kind of floated around, but that it kind of split into two halves. There were women who really wanted to focus on being able to have a proper professional life, get paid properly, be recognised in their work as a professional architect. And then there was the others of us who were just really interested in how you might think about architecture very differently. How if you brought issues around feminism and gender to architecture, you'd actually have to really shift the nature of education and the nature of the discipline itself, the nature of the profession. And so this conference, Feminism versus Professionalism in Building Design, was very much about recognising that difference and thinking about how that might be explored and developed. Thank you, you're doing really well. And out of that, the group who wanted to do things very differently formed Matrix, so that was in 1980. So moved away from the notion of the Feminist Design Collective, that much larger group, but was still quite a large group. Here's a poster from the early days, from the very first piece of work that Matrix did, which was over here. We are a group of women trained in architecture, building and related skills. We aim to use our skills to support particularly women, but also other groups who are fighting to take control of the buildings they need and use and the process of making them. Also to evolve new ways of working. So there were a whole set of different things that came out of this idea that you might organise design methods differently. I mean, that was within a kind of quite a world where, within the UK anyway, within quite a lot of the big cities, as you know, Katie mentioned Byker, there were quite a lot of architects and particularly planners looking at how you might do much more participatory processes with users. So in that really early days, we also did an exhibition called Home Truths. Part, again, I think, of what was really interesting is that the aim was to do a lot of different things. It wasn't just about running an architecture practice or doing those particular sorts of jobs. And I just love this slide because I think those were the things we were reading. Those were the kind of, there was a huge amount of often quite community-paced newsletters and magazines that were responding to and informing this kind of set of related movements across civil rights, across participatory practices, across, in many ways, fighting the state, the idea that the state was actually building really horrible housing, building motorways, not working in terms of kind of popular politics. And some of that was international, of course. But it was also true when we were trying to look at, because we had this kind of, because we had a book group as well, we were trying to actually write some things that explained what Matrix was about, and what the issues were. When we looked at what was around, for us there was some really good work going on in feminist geography. There was some really interesting stuff happening in the States, which we had knowledge of some of it, and then since then we found out a lot more about other things that were going on in the States. But this was kind of fantastic for us, that we could find things to begin to inform what we were trying to do. And that led to the Matrix book, which I can talk about because I was really involved in that more than with the design practice. And I guess we started that at the end of just at the tail end of the 70s, and it was published in 84, and it came out of an enormous number of really interesting meetings around kitchen tables, in the garden of people's houses or flats, kind of fitted in all around all the other jobs that people had and the other things that they were doing, to try and put together a kind of set of things that would explain to us, I think, as well as to everybody else, why this was important. And I guess the most immediate thing was this kind of imagery of the middle-class, white, suburban housewife. It was still, we were kind of at the tail end, I think, of a kind of real attempt to build space, kind of to divide it so that, you had this image of the husband goes off to work and the wife's at home looking after the kids, this kind of, and it was the tail end because we were all, and I speak for myself, but it's true generally, we were that generation, particularly of white middle-class women who came out of the post-war period and went into higher education in much larger numbers than had happened previously. So we were being taught these models of kind of how you designed and what women's role was, that just didn't in any way, they didn't correlate to reality, and they certainly didn't correlate to our reality. So these are a couple of images from the Making Space book. This in a piece by Sue Francis, which was, so in the 1970s, that's absolutely standard. That was the design guide, that's Space in the Home, where you can see that, and in fact, if you look at the black-clad figure, i.e. the woman, she's basically stuck to the kitchen sink the entire time. She gets to wander off here, that's it. And in fact, there's a really great, the second page of this, which goes to the second half of the day, the last picture, he comes in from work, second to last picture, and in the last picture, he's slumped in front of the TV like this. And he's obviously really tired, he deserves me. And she's round the back cooking the dinner and putting the children to bed. Or, there's that kind of stereotypical image was given as design advice, like neutral design advice. This is how you designed houses. So it's hard, I mean, to me that's still hard to believe that that's how it happened. And here on this side is from Introduction to Housing Layout, same sort of period, mid-70s, when there was a real shift from building modernist houses, modernist tower blocks, to these kind of more quaint looking, still very densely built, but more quaint looking kind of lots of little alleyways. And I mean, to me, and I'd be interested about the room, but to me it says on the bottom, it says to us, this image here says to us, come in, this might lead somewhere interesting. There may be an exit. That image never said that to me. That image says, I'm not going down there, I've got no idea what's going to happen around the corner. There's a completely gendered response to that, which is again assumed not to be the case. It's not built into it. So those were the kinds of things that were the standard neutral framework when we were studying.
Okay, you're going to go next.
Yes.
At the same time, there was what was really informing us was this incredibly active, dynamic, fractious women's movement, and we were all really very deeply engaged in that in different ways and in different things. And I got particularly involved with Women and Manual Trades, which was a group of women who had wanted to go into construction. And I mean, I think what's quite interesting, if you look now on building sites and think how many women are working actually on the tools, it's still incredibly few. I don't think it's even changed very much. But at that time, it was the very first sort of moment where women were saying, I'm going to pick up a saw, I'm going to learn to be a carpenter, I'm going to go on site, and I'm going to earn decent money at last by doing this job. And the women who did it were amazing. I just thought they were the most inspiring, exciting women I'd ever met, and I just wanted to be one. And I then trained as an architect, as a bricklayer, and worked on site for Hackney Council and a couple of other projects. And I also kind of went to Matrix and said, look, we shouldn't just be designing buildings and talking to clients and talking, consulting with people and parties. We should also be building the buildings, and we should be, encouraging the people who are going to use the buildings to build their own buildings. And I remember, and we were just talking about this, people saying, look, Fran, it's difficult enough being a group of women architects. What are you talking about? This is going to be impossible. So Matrix continued to focus on architecture, but there was very strong connections with women in construction. And one of the first projects we did was Lambeth Women's Workshop, which was designing with women a space that would then teach, where women could then learn construction skills. And it was all built by women. So they came from all over the UK to this workshop in Lambeth in London to build it. And it was a really kind of unique moment of kind of meeting up of ideas and politics, and influenced us all a lot. And then we were also involved with this women's education in building, so it was a bigger project where women could, a wider project where women could learn building skills, drawing, and then there was loads of stuff going on there. There were evening classes where women could particularly focused on women doing building work. So it was part of a kind of women's movement idea that by doing it and learning to do it and using your body to do these skills, you could change some of the way that you are relating to the built environment.
At the same time, we set up the actual working group of Matrix, which really came about because we were approached by women who said, oh, there's a group of women architects, will you look at various things for us? So the first thing that we looked at was Stockpile Health Centre, where basically we wrote a brief which just thought about the health centre in a different way, so that it actually catered for women and talked about health and all sorts of things, and actually had children's spaces in it. And then we were asked to design Dalston Children's Centre, which was basically a really amazing idea that quite a lot of women in Hackney had, which was about there being a children's centre on the corner of every street. So it wasn't just a place, it wasn't just a nursery, it was somewhere where you could actually leave your child, whether they were ill or whether you wanted to be with your child, that there were lots of different ways of thinking about childcare. It wasn't just that you had to do it in one particular way. And so we looked at lots of buildings for them and found a building in the end. And we also, that led to, at the same time as that was going on, there were a lot of groups that were doing community technical aid centres, and Matrix managed to set up as a community technical aid centre and got funding from the GLC Women's Committee to talk to community groups about what they wanted and what they needed. And that became a sort of very transformative thing for women. I mean, for example, when we were first involved in Dalston Children's Centre, they were offered a very small house, which by the time they put it in the fire escape, there would have been no space left for the children to play. So we said, you don't want that building, you want a completely different building. And we looked in the local area and found this disused bathhouse, and worked with the group to turn it into a children's centre, which had things like photography for parents to do, places where people could meet, as well as places for childcare. And one of the things was making this model with the children's centre. I mean, actually, when we found the building, it was very derelict, and lots of them said we couldn't possibly use this. It's absolutely appalling. You know, nobody could move in here. And we said we've just got to get the money to do it. And so we made this model at 1 to 25 doll's house size so that everybody could be involved in looking at it. And we also looked, on the right you can see in plan, there's the building that they were temporarily in, which was 2 stories, and we showed them how that would fit within the space which they got given to them. And so what we were trying to do was to actually not just say, it's all right, we can design you a nice building. We were trying to get people involved in thinking about space in a different way, and how making sure that they could actually understand what we were showing them with technical drawings, which meant that they could really be critical of our work. And so there's the model and people talking about it, and that gives you an idea of the spaces that we ended up with. Oops, sorry. The other building that we did, which was a really important building, was the Jackanory Asian Women's Centre. This was again was funded by the GLC, and we did the work initially through technical aid. And what was interesting about that was the group came to us and they said, can you help us put a porta cabin on this site? We've got a really good site on Whitechapel Road. And we said, yeah, sure, what do you want to do in the porta cabin? And they said they wanted to do dancing, they wanted to do badminton, they wanted to do English as a foreign language, they wanted to do mother tongue classes, they wanted a creche, they wanted all of these things. And we said, well, that won't fit in the porta cabin. And they said, well, we don't think we'll get anything else. And we said, let's see what we can get. So we worked with them to design a building and put into the Greater London Council for funding for it, and got it, much to our amazement. But it was a whole exercise in working with women to think outside the box. Women have just been so used to making do with the spaces that they're given, rather than thinking creatively about what do they really want, and they haven't had that opportunity, or they certainly haven't until this point. So in the end we designed this 3-story building, which 4-story building rather, which had a creche at the back, and the little building that you can see at the bottom in the right was the creche at the back of the courtyard. And that was, again, sort of people who were using the main building for all of the different classes and things that they wanted to do in the main building, wanted to be able to see the children and see that they were happy and that they were okay, but they didn't want to be able to hear them or for the children to see them. So it was really important sort of thinking about the building in a different way, but also reassuring the women who came that their children were being properly looked after. So we made lots of models, we worked a lot with them and discovered lots of things about creating buildings. And one of the things that we felt very strongly as well was that buildings should be designed for longevity. And we worked really hard we put in a very high budget for this at the time. And the reason for that was because we knew that community groups never got funding for maintenance. And again, that was what happened. And so this building actually was completed in 1986, and to this date it's never been decorated, and it's still okay. Just about. This was another scheme that we did, working very closely with a housing association in Seltshire, and it was a scheme for single mothers in South London, and it was trying to combat loneliness and also give people support with their children. So it was 12 flats. Women in architectural education.
Yes, I think that's jump up. You finished? Yes,
Yeah.
on the other. So obviously we're jumping around a bit, but we're trying to cover the range of things that were happening, some in parallel, some one after the other, some very successfully, some less successfully. Another thing that we were really interested in, I think, was architectural education and how you might shift the kind of assumptions that have been built into it. This was another one of the sessions that we ran, but also particularly led by Sue Francis. She developed a Women into Architecture and Building access course, which was run for many, many years at what was then the Polytechnic of North London, is now the University of North London. There's been other things in the middle. And together with Yvonne Dean. And that course was very much, as you can see, it's into architecture and building. That course was a foundation course for women from all sorts of backgrounds to enable them to get a portfolio together that meant that they could apply to go onto an architecture course, whether at North London or other places. It still exists, but it got wrapped into other kind of foundation courses that were happening, so it lost some of its kind of radical edge. And I mean, we haven't talked about it very much, but it may come up in questions. This whole period, I think, there were so many. The GLC was under Ken Livingstone, was very radical. It had a women's committee. It was supporting these sorts of community-based activities. There were funds to do those things. This at the Polytechnic of North London, they had a women's unit. They supported in many different ways the access course. So it was a kind of setting where it wasn't that we weren't fighting for these things, but we were part of many, many people trying to move these things forward. Thank you. And just to give, I don't know how easy that is to see from a distance, but to try and kind of capture some of those different aspects. So in terms of teaching, we've already talked about the evening classes. I've just talked about the access into architecture and building. Sue Francis worked with the Medical Architecture Research Unit at Polytechnic of North London. In terms of research, all sorts of developments, both in terms of things like the Women's Design Service, which began to develop different leaflets and guides, work around different kinds of feminist and alternative practices. There's a kind of explosion, really, and then development of those things. And Thorne Architects, which we'll talk about. I mentioned the Women's Design Service, and a whole series of kind of other spin-offs and developments, which again, I think we're not mapping it very effectively for you, but it's kind of important that those things, we don't just talk about matrix. Right.
Okay, so Thorne Architects came, was created out of quite a large group, quite a few of the matrix women working was in 1991. And much later, somebody asked me to write something about women, and I just thought, okay, let's just ask the women who are doing the work. So I did quite a long thing of interviewing everybody who was working at Thorne Architects, and it was really interesting. But what I just wanted to pick out really was this thing, because I think this was so much came through all our work and all the different different areas that all of us were working in, was that it's about the process, and that what this young woman said to me was, it's what you do. I've learned something that you do, and the way that you get people to contribute, to be part of designing, is something completely new. And once you've done it like that, you cannot imagine why you would do it any differently. And she said to me, I will take that with me wherever I go. And I thought, well, that's absolutely wonderful, because actually that's what really is significant about the way that we've been working, is that you don't make good buildings unless all those people who are going to be using the buildings, who are, bring all their complex experience and their expertise to the table. Unless you can find some way of getting their input, you're not going to make good buildings. So I think that was the really kind of key thing.
This is an illustration from the book. With Liz Millen, did a whole series about the Making Space book. With Liz Millen, we did a whole series of photographs of what it was like in the 70s trying to get across the city. And this is around Archway, where you had to go underground basically, or walk across very heavy traffic. And the difficulties of anybody who's caring for anybody else who's either a child or disabled or whatever, of traversing the city at that time was really huge. And so that was something that I was very much involved in the book. And then what goes around comes around. We got asked to look at Aldgate subways, which was this extraordinary part of the City of London. You can see outlined in red there, where there are 28 exits from the subways. And as you can see, people didn't think a lot of it. They graffitied the maps and everything. And we were asked to look at it by Metropolitan University, who had centralised their library there. And suddenly people stopped using the library, and they wanted us to survey and find out why people had stopped using the library. And what we discovered was that nobody wanted to go through these 28 exits. And what was interesting was that we also looked at the Metropolitan Police figures, and actually it was probably one of the safest places in London because no criminals wanted to go down there either. So what we did was to actually remap it, working with graphic designers and artists, looking at different zones, which meant that you could very quickly identify where you were going to, which colour you wanted to follow, and how you would get through that part of the city. And the other part that we probably felt most, we did most successfully, was to get rid of some of the subways. Because what we observed was that if you stood on the corners and watched, the cars actually had to stop anyway. So people could walk across in order for the cars to go around the gyratory. And so we actually filled in subways and put trees in them. But the interesting thing when we were surveying around there was that actually men and women didn't want to go down the subways, but the difference was that men could quite often jump over the railings, whereas women were often looking after children or had other responsibilities and couldn't leap over the railings, so were having to negotiate these really derelict and horrible spaces. So we made these light boxes and put shops in the subways, and where we couldn't get rid of them. Over to you.
Okay. So the last couple of projects really. This one's really here because it was another one of including people. So it's a building in a park, and what was very important was how could everybody who lives around the park take ownership of this building so that it actually stayed, wasn't vandalised. And it was a very active park group, and what they said was, we want to build a straw bale building. Lots of people thought that was a really crazy thing to do in the middle of a park, but actually it was incredibly brilliant idea. And so people from all around, apart from all these very different routes, people from Broad Farm Estate, people from the different housing all around, were all involved in building it, and it was a really enjoyable process, at the end of it, again, I kind of interviewed some of the straw balers about what they had experienced, what they thought about doing it, and they just said, it just really, I now feel this is part of mine. I have a sort of, this is my space. I built it. I should be coming back. I should be having tea here, and I should be using it. And it's been, even now, it's actually not really been vandalised. It's been very successful building. So the same sort of thing of people being involved in designing it and then building it.
Now we're moving on to a current project at Thorne Architects, which is just about to finish, which is the Cohousing Project. And this is the common house that you can see. So basically what it consists of is 23 houses, which are individual houses, and then there's a shared common house, which is this old mill that you can see on the right. And that will be where meals are served a minimum of 3 times a week. And your only obligation is that you have to join in with making the meals. You don't have any other communal obligation. But the more people are involved, the less things like service charges and so on cost, obviously. And this, interestingly enough, is a self-build project. And when I was at Newcastle University, I wrote my thesis on self-build, which is an awful long time ago, so it's taken a long time to realise that. And it's been really good fun. There are now all of 22 households have been sold. The 23rd is just going through. But there were 8 households who bought the site together. And, well, as the chair at the time said, right, everybody, let's hold hands and jump, and we did. And we bought the site, and it's been developed. And so this is the street with the houses on it, and to the right in timber are to the right-hand side of the left photograph, you can see the flats, which are being built, and they're all built around the pond, which you can see on the right. And in the site plan at the bottom, you can see it's quite an extensive pond with the flats around the right-hand side and then the street which runs past it. It's been a very exciting project. Everybody's been very much involved in choosing all sorts of things like the colours of the houses, their own kitchens, all sorts of things. Except for when the planners interfered and said no, they didn't like the colours. But so this gives you an overall idea of the scheme, and yeah, people have come on site sort of from the very beginning and stood in their house to see what it was going to be like. Okay, yes, it's all built, designed to Pascal standards. Sorry,
And lifetime.
and lifetime
If we're going to do this plug.
Thank you, thank you.
So we're kind of winding to a conclusion here, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about revisiting Matrix, what sorts of things are happening in the current moment. So we've talked about, and Katie's been incredibly, and Adam, very supportive about what kinds of things, what kind of archive we might have, what kinds of other oral histories, whether we can get the book reprinted. We're kind of aware that there's a whole series of things that we like to do in a situation where, you know, building houses, working full time, it's still quite hard for us to find the room. It's kind of like it was in those days, in the Matrix days. And one of the things that happened is that Julia Dwyer and I wrote a piece, began to think about what an archive would be like of feminist architectural material. And could you do it in a way, given we've talked so much about process, and archives so often end up being about representation. They're the kind of thing that gets put in a cabinet, it's on a wall that you read. And we were trying to look at how you might be able to talk about process. So one of the things we looked at is, this is the copy of the Matrix book. It's not been torn apart, it's front and back, that the Bartlett has. So this, and if you look at it inside, you can see how many times it's been read, and if you look at it inside, it's been there so long that it has all those paper bits that they used to put stamps on. Some of you may not even recognise as an idea, going back many, many years. And then it's got loads of kind of yellow highlighter pen people's little pencil comments in the side. So this sense of it being worked over is both really lovely and also like, could the Bartlett not have bought another one? So there's something about that and about how that has process built into it, and we've looked at, Julia did a really lovely piece about some of the drawings that she was involved in, and how in writing about that as part of a much bigger process, you might have a different way of understanding those drawings that could also critique some of the things around how Matrix was organised or how architecture was organised. And the other thing that's been happening is we are being asked to exhibit stuff, and of course we do have stuff, but it's under people's beds. We're not like, you know, the big name architects who have some archivist who collects all their stuff, or who somehow knew in their 20s they were going to be famous, but they started keeping stuff then. We're like, oh my God, where is all this stuff? And you think, oh, I remember that. And the stuff pops up in all sorts of odd places, but it is mainly under beds and in cupboards and in unsorted and unarchivable boxes. This is from an exhibition that's been touring called Still I Rise, which has been at the Arnolfini and the Nottingham Contemporary. Some of you may have seen it at Nottingham Contemporary. This model wasn't in all of those, but there was again, that exhibition has attempted, I think, to try and show feminist artefacts in a slightly different way. So that's kind of work in progress. Is there anything else I should say about that? No? No. Okay. Yes, if you go on to the next one, I think that the last thing that we wanted to end on is, because Julia can't be here, she wrote just a couple of paragraphs that kind of sum up everything so nicely that we decided to leave it till the end. I've got who's going to read it, Fran.
In 1999, 10 years after I had left Matrix, Annie and I concluded in a paper we had written that although Matrix was not a campaigning group, but a practice devoted to building, its influences were disseminated by publications, videos, lectures, teaching, courses, and contacts with women students and practitioners. And we asked, was this in the end more important than the building themselves? 20 years later, it feels like everything's changed, and I've had to recalibrate what is important since that question was asked. There's now an expanding and confident discourse about feminist practices of resistance, which have served to articulate and validate the diverse scales at which we work and the variety of strategies that we adopt. Making and evolving energy-conscious architecture, enabling new working and living collectives, creating new teaching practices which directly address inclusivity, and even making art within hospital communities sit hand in hand with careful and critical research, talks, books, and papers. This work is being shared across digital as well as analog networks, flattening and widening its impact. This much wider field of interconnected practice is amazingly encouraging to current and future feminist practitioners, allowing you to respond to contemporary conditions in ways we couldn't have imagined. It has taken a long time for this to emerge, and we still need to safeguard these ways of working even now. Given this, it's very important to us that the Newcastle School of Architecture has supported this discourse by enabling tonight's talk and making its position clear. Brilliant.
Oh, yes.
Well, did you want to? I mean, what we wanted was for you to tell us about what you're interested in, and what you want to talk about. Did you want to say something?
Please, no, I just wanted to make sure that people felt invited to ask questions and make comments.
Turn the lights up a bit so I can get people's faces.
Yeah, so we don't know enough about where you're coming from and what you're particularly interested in out of all this. It's a sort of bit of a seething mass. So will you tell us? Yeah.
Do you think you have design principles from a feminist point of view?
Yeah.
Are they in the book, or are they, do you what are they? Some of them.
I think they're process.
I think
all
that's
about
what we've
process.
been talking about. Really, they're about the validity. They're about what everybody brings to the table.
But they've also evolved. Like there's this, the things that have evolved. There's, we've become very. We were talking about this on the train. That there's been a lot of thought gone into the actual environment that you're making and using environmentally friendly materials and checking out what the actual materiality is of the things that you're using to design with. So breathing more construction, using natural materials, making sure you're not using things that off-gas, trying to avoid things like that. That's been very much part of our designing practice. And also we've gradually got more and more into making things so that they're environmentally friendly. So now we only design to passive house standards, for example, at Thorne Architects. And that's because we feel very strongly that climate change is a huge issue. We've felt that strongly for quite a long time. And we've developed our practice to address that. And it's not just that, but it's also fuel poverty, that's really important, particularly for women and for women-headed households. It's incredibly important. That's probably where a lot of people are spending a huge amount of money, let alone what's happening to the climate.
And I think, I mean, we say about process, but I also think that it's not, feminism isn't one thing. There isn't a set of principles that you can write down and then say you do it like this. That's not what feminism has ever been or should be. So in terms for something like, when I hear Anne speak, I really respect that thing which is about really understanding how women's experience is likely to be different to men's because of the way society is structured, and linking that into wider issues around things like climate change. Because I work a lot in education, my version of feminism would be I'm really interested in how we might go on subverting education, and we do a lot of stuff around understanding how space is gendered or disabling, or how you might queer it, or how you might use particular design methods that work to creatively breach kind of normative ways of organising built space or of organising education. So my version of taking this forward is different to Thorne Architects, for example, but it's still it's principled, but and ethical, but it's not a.
The reason I'm asking is because I've just done a postgraduate in Belgium, and it was a design build course, and I'm a builder, and none of the architects seem to have any principles about how to design, and we were designing a women's space, and I'm not an architect, and I was really frustrated that they have no ethics, really. They said they did, but we were designing, I'm a natural builder as well, so, but I'm interested in, how do people get to that? I know it's a process, but if you haven't got an idea of community or empathy, then how is that process, how do you tell someone what that process is? That's what I'm interested in, breaking it down for people who actually don't know where to come from.
Yeah, well, I think it's all about asking questions, isn't it? And what sort of let all these. As an architect, you're in control of this vast kind of technical web, and which you're specifying, and you're both in control of it and not it's in control of you. And so you're making very specific choices all the time. And if you don't understand the sort of the meaning, of the materials you're specifying, like who dug them out of the ground, how did they come to this country? What's their carbon footprint? What did it mean to create them? What's it like to actually build with them? Then you're missing out. I think you're missing out on some very important dimension.
As a non-architect, do you think that ego is still a very central point to the design process?
No. It doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be.
You can design without it.
That's the right thing.
Yeah, what do you all think?
That was my experience.
There's lots of architects here, I'm sure. Aren't there? Who's an architect? Yeah, so is ego really important?
No, but I just want to say something. The other day I gave a lecture on light, and I presented 3 male architects. And I remember the day before I went to bed and I thought, wow, I'm going to talk about 3 people I don't relate to at all. And yes, here I am, celebrating their architecture through a particular angle. And so it was prior to the strike, I was in a raging mood, and actually I 190 students, and I started the lecture by saying, I am going to present you 3 projects by 3 people who I don't relate to. And then I started to feel bad about it. Why am I not presenting also women architects? And then I thought, well, is it my fault entirely? And now what you've pinpointed now is that partly because I think they're not as published, because they don't seek publication necessarily. And the other aspect is that this aspect of process is the one thing that is not celebrated or not covered in publications. It's completely overlooked because we're still focusing on the outcome, at least for publication. So we're struggling, because I was thinking, where am I going to seek that material? And I don't have the answer, but it's frustrating.
But it's important just to know, I think, it's important just to know that you're looking for something and you've thought that thought, you know, that's actually a big, that's really important.
What was lovely actually was to have all these first year female architects kind of nodding. You know, just that was good.
What else? What other?
So I'm not an architect, I'm a developer, but I'm interested in, I'm a geographer actually, so it was very interesting to hear you talk about feminist geography. When I studied geography, there was I think she was quite famous, she used to tell us she was famous anyway, Janet Townsend, who was a feminist geography of women's sphere, and that was the first time I started to try and look at things from a feminist perspective. I found it very interesting, probably quite early on in my career, but I'm interested in architecture as a profession. So my observation would be, certainly up here in the North East, that we have some excellent female architects, but they would tend to focus their careers on the conceptual early stage part of the process.
Yeah.
But when it comes to technicians or hands-on project managers or on the construction sites, there still seems to me to be a tremendous bias towards males, at least in the North East.
It's
when it
true.
comes to that, and I just, as a profession, I don't know if that's just my observation or whether it's statistically.
It is statistically true throughout the industry, and it's to do with I think it's to do with the whole construction of the building industry and the relationships between architects and developers and contractors and the whole subcontracting and contractual kind of basis of how buildings are built here, that makes it very, very difficult for women to move across that divide. And I think what's really interesting is that where you've seen women move is more into the kind of office-based project management kind of side of things. And it's still really unusual seeing women confidently on site.
So what is it? So as a profession, again, just my own observations, but actually I think women would tend to do a better job. There's maybe less ego, less bravado, less competition.
Because the whole thing in the building industry is whatever you're doing, it's all about team. It's a team. To get a building built involves a huge number of people from the very first thinking until it's completed. There's hundreds of people, and I spend all my time in meetings with lots of people who have to work together to produce this. So being able to do that and being able to work cooperatively and listen to what other people are saying, and all really useful skills, which we all know women are often.
And I do think, I think what's interesting for me over the years is, and I know less about the kind of contracting side, but it is that the building industry, the architectural profession, somehow I don't know quite how it does it, but it still seems to maintain a kind of quite a male-dominated thing, and it's hard to work out why that happens, because I think with lawyers, they had a law had a really concerted effort. Doesn't mean lots of women have, don't get into high positions, but in terms of increasing the number of women in different positions, they were really successful. Whereas if you look at, I'm going to get into about architects, but if you look at the RIBA and the number of women who register, and again registering with the RIBA is kind of quite a complex thing in the first place, but it's still, the figures have not, they've never improved. The number of women coming into architecture education has increased, very positively. But the follow through as you go up is just, women just drop out. They don't sign up with the RIBA. The kind of fallout rate, and if you're thinking about women of colour, or you're thinking about disabled women, or then you don't even get that far. So it just really interests me that's seems like a really.
But
why is that
I
so
think
intractable?
I think it is exactly. I think it is to do with the technical nature of building work and the way that men hold on to those.
But I don't think it is only that. I think there's a whole thing, there's a whole culture, for example, in architects' offices, which is about if you stay till midnight every night, then you're a hero. And, how many women can do that? And there's and not many men can or should, and there's a whole culture. We tried really hard, both in Matrix and in Thorne Architects, that everybody left at 6 o'clock. That's the end of the day. And it wasn't always successful. There are deadlines you've got to meet. There's no doubt about it. It's jolly hard being an architect. You never know when the planning permission's going to come through and you've got to get the job done to the next stage. But, that the idea that it's not a good thing to stay late at night is the starting point. The idea is that you're being efficient and you leave on time, and that's really important. And lots of women, can't cope with midnight.
Yeah, there's lots of interconnecting kind of cultural and big issues.
But
But I do think your
Sorry, did you want to say
observations,
anything?
you know.
Yes.
No, I just wanted to sort of. I find one of the things I find really sort of extraordinary about sort of the early days was this sort of the training in the trades, this critique of the relations between the architects and construction workers, and I was sort of. And in a way, if you think of all the kind of threads that have kept going, there are some that have really flourished. I mean, things that Matrix was doing and that have really, carried on and informed and inspired people. And I think your question just reminds me in a way that seems to be, with the caveat really around self-build, that seems to have didn't flourish in the same way. And I just wondered about your reflections on why not, or if there are sort of vestiges of it or traces of it that we can still sort of.
I think it's an industry-wide issue. It's not just architecture, it's surveying, property law, even at the finance funding level. It's
somebody else.
Sorry, you got your hand up the whole time. Oh, you, yes.
I guess I was just to take it back to what you were saying about construction. I kind of feel like maybe the kind of intersection there is something to do with class.
Yeah.
For university educated women who go into a kind of who are exposed to these radical processes, the possibility to think larger, to kind of escape those binaries is much more feasible. But then perhaps if you are poor, to like the binaries of masculinity and femininity and the kind of protective mechanisms of that kind of infrastructure, because of much more precarious living circumstances, you revert to kind of understandings of that kind of patriarchal idea of where you belong. I think class is really inherent in all of this. I think class is kind of more than ever at the kind of within the construction of our cities. Women can exist in public space in a completely different way now. But I think actually space is being divided much more now with class, and again, if you think about race or ability, generally disabled people are much poorer, people of colour are much poorer, I think class is maybe the important intersection in these kind of discussions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's happened in the period from when we were your age is that, you know, when we were involved in NAM, it was we were about unionising. We used to talk about the lump, which was non-unionised labour, and you know, the sort of subcontracting world has developed so much that we all just think that is normal. You know, that is the way you build, that you offload responsibility further and further down the chain until in the end, you know, it's someone who's only being paid when it doesn't rain, who's got to drive 4 hours to get to the job, and who's probably Polish, or you know. So the conditions for working on site nowadays are really cruel, and they're very badly paid and very exploited people. And yeah, so of course you're right. Yeah.
I was more interested with when you began how public perception, both within the industry and lay, and how whether the people that you were working with, apart from the community groups itself, how they reacted to it. And
well, that's quite an interesting story we could
I
tell.
mean,
Yeah.
I suppose because like, public perception is so important with these things, and feeding back to many people's questions, I would always come across as this angry young person on site, and as a woman, which is quite an anomaly. So it was, yeah. So I don't know, how did you navigate those and fighting those stereotypes, or did you fall into those tropes? Or?
Well, the first story that we thought about that was actually here at Newcastle University when unusually, because 5% of women were architects, I mean 5% of architects were women at that point, but in our year at Newcastle we were 25% were women, and there was a group project that we were supposed to do which was about housing. And the women were all very different, but they all thought it would be quite interesting to see if all the women got together and did the housing together rather than being spread around, whether or not we'd come up with something different. And that caused complete and utter uproar. And we couldn't believe it actually, because it didn't seem, you know, we hadn't thought that we were making a radical suggestion. And so first of all, the guy who was running our, tutor said, no way. And we said, well, why not? It would be really interesting. And then he got the professor in to talk to us and tell us that we shouldn't do it. And we said, well, we can't see why we shouldn't do it. So then he got his wife, who was an architect, to come and tell us that we shouldn't be doing it. So it was, it was just quite a small thing.
So did you do it anyway?
Of course we did. And we just stubbornly carried on
for our work. That's how they get.
But Fran and I have stubbornly carried on doing all sorts of things as her jobs. But it is a matter of just carrying on. But it is still astonishing. How old am I? I'm ancient, and I've been on site. Since I was I've worked in an architect's practice since I was 16, in fact, one way or another. And still on site, I do get asked why I'm there as a woman, and it is an extraordinary thing, actually. Extraordinary. I'm really shocked by that now.
I have a question about the early projects, the early build projects. How were you financing the practice? Were you working full time as Matrix then? And did you have, a lot of practices have kind of bread and butter clients that they do projects for that they maybe don't publicise as much in order to devote more time to more community-led or more, artist-led or whatever project. Did you have, what else were you doing? Did you have something else?
Yeah, it's really important to understand how completely different it was. So we had no student debt. We were squatting. So we had, our overheads were incredibly low. And if push came to shove, you could sign on and get your 20 quid a week or whatever. So we were not working
well, some people were working, but that was the other way that we did it. So there was, there were about 4 of us who actually were doing projects, and then there was a whole support group. So there were people who came in and helped when it came to, you know, getting a project done and you know, putting in a bid or whatever else to get something.
And then the other thing I wanted to say about that was, so I was working on site, for instance, so I was earning money, but the other thing that we did was that there were children involved, so it was also about childcare. So sometimes you know, you might have been drawing, but you might also have been looking after children. And when I said to someone just recently, and they just couldn't believe it, like, you know, like to do childcare, you get paid, you know, £5 an hour, and as an architect, you get paid blah blah. So, you know, how could you conceivably do that? And we just thought that's what you had to do. If women who had children were going to work as architects, then women who didn't have children and other people and men would have to look after the children. So it was incredibly sort of, I don't know, like, you just got to do it, you know. But it was totally different. You couldn't do it in the same way now. You just couldn't, because you've got so many, you know, you need all the money just to survive.
And there was just much more, I mean, especially that moment with the GLC, there was just much more. There was public funding for those sorts of projects. I mean, you had to invest time in making those bids, and they weren't easy. But there was that public funding, there was a relatively thriving public sector that was recognised as a public sector. It wasn't a kind of public-private hybrid, or so you could also take quite an ethical stance. You could quite deliberately not do work that was kind of commercial.
Charge like reasonable fees as well.
Yeah.
You know, you're not race to the bottom. You won't.
Because you're writing
I mean, you
those
still
fees
have to
in.
be competitive. We've always had to be competitive. You don't get away with that. But yeah. But when we started Thorne Architects, though, I mean, you know, by that point, Margaret Thatcher had come in and things had gone haywire. So we did all sorts of things, you know, to make the practice go.
How many, sorry,
Yeah.
I was going to ask how many bricks you could lay in a day.
No, I'm just not going to answer.
Just a question.
I think there was an answer out there,
I think obviously you were quite sort of humble about the way Matrix came about and your early work. But when did you sort of realise that what you were doing mattered? That it wasn't sort of, oh, this is just the way we thought we were going to do it with the kids, and you know, that you're actually sort of making a change in the way that we practice and in the way that things are being built. Like, was there a few moments that felt like, oh wow, this was
I think
This is so, yes, like, I didn't think about it from the beginning, but these people rightly did.
But I did just because of the reaction that we got when we said things. I mean, you know, if everybody wants to stop you doing something, you think, oh, hang on a minute, what have we done?
But also you think, hang on a minute, maybe this could be really interesting.
Yeah.
And how are we going to find out unless we do? But the other thing I was going to say was that you've got to sort of imagine this time. You know, we were really involved in the women's movement. We were all in consciousness raising groups. We were in socialist feminist networks. So everywhere you went, it was like a seething. You know, you couldn't get away with saying anything without someone immediately jumping down your throat and saying, "How can you say that? Because you haven't thought about this, that, and the other." So it was so productive. You were just thinking all the time about. So,
and there were just lots of people in other areas. You know, there were people in participatory planning. There were lots of planners. There were people in film and video, community film and video workshops. There were people like alternative printers who print stuff for you for
there were people saying wages for
collective
housework.
support. So there was wages.
And there were people who say, "No way should we be paying money. It's not about money."